This is the Unlock Your Inner Creator series, and I'm your host, Noilyn Mendoza. My intention with this series is to spark conversations with passionate changemakers and creatives that bravely dared to dream of new ways and took massive action. Despite the chaos that's happening around us, a radical and liberated future, a new earth can be realized and is possible if we choose to take brave steps. So I invite you to explore with me what that could look like. Welcome, everybody. This is the fourth episode of the second season of the Unlock Your Creator series. Today is November 3rd. And the word November actually comes from the Latin novum, which means 9. So did you actually know that there were only 10 months before January and February were added? So ninth actually means completion. So how are we going towards completion or endings? That's a question I want to pose to you. And how do you feel when things come to a close and you complete a cycle? And then interestingly enough, November also, as we know, it is 11, so 1-1. And when you think about 11, it's symbolic of entering a new stage in life and the ability to transcend to a higher level. November is significant for me as well because November 1st, in my culture, we celebrate our ancestors. So I just think it's fitting when we think about endings, completion. In many respects, it's also the death so that there could be life afterwards. So what does that mean to us? With that, this season of the Unlock Your Inner Creator series is about processing endings and beginnings. My intention for this series has been to spark conversations with passionate changemakers and creatives that bravely dare to dream of new ways and they took massive action. So as we open up this conversation, I call on the energy and the power of transition. What does it mean for you to be at the threshold, to be in between the old as you step forth in the new? I invite you to explore with me what that could look like. And I'm super excited to have a longtime colleague, Yejin Lee, who is here. So welcome, Yejin. Yejin is amazing. So I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to read her bio right now. So she's a career coach, a nonprofit consultant, and an executive coach. Yejin has dedicated the past decade of her life to the evergreen pursuit of dismantling white supremacy culture in the nonprofit world. She has worked as the head of organizational design at a civic tech nonprofit and has several years of fundraising experience in formal and informal education institutions, combining a background in anti-violence organizing, organizational problem solving, fundraising, and development operations, and the translating of anti-racism within the internal systems and processes. She strives to build power with and for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So Yejin, amazing, amazing work. Is there anything else that you would like to share with us?
I've been spending a lot of my life, especially in the last year and a half, trying to also disentangle my life from capitalism. So it is always funny to start introductions with what I do. I'm a Korean American person. I'm trying to return to my lightness and wholeness. I have an amazing Shiba Inu who's very discerning and likes my partner much more than he likes me. I like dancing. So I just wanted to share other parts of myself because, the work that we do is so heavy and hard and sort of requires investment in wholeness. So I just wanted to share those pieces too.
I love that. And thank you for bringing that in because, yeah, it's so true, right? A lot of the work that we do is heavy, is hard, could really be serious, because it is serious, right? We're trying to change things in this world. But also the fact, I love how you brought in your dog, you love in your love of dance, all of that, because that is all of us, right? We're not so siloed. And yeah, I just appreciate that because I think for a really long time, a lot of us were told in the spaces that we're in, it's like, you can't actually show your whole self. It's not okay. But there's so many parts of us. So thank you again for lifting that up.
It's a new practice for me. So I'm trying.
I love it. Yeah. And it is. It's a practice, right? And we're trying to be seen. And I think this is part of it. I always like to start these conversations and I want to call people in. So, who would you like to call in? Who are the people that have been most influential to you, Yejin?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I think that one of my favorite things about myself, if it's that's a weird thing to start this conversation with, but is my willingness to be changed and transformed by people. So I really say that, I am who I am because of the comrades that I have in my life. But specifically, I would like to bring into this conversation my mother. She was someone that I was super close to, even though in terms of personality, we're wildly different. She was someone who was incredibly invested in her principles. And I learned to be someone who lived with integrity. And she defined integrity not just as being morally upright, but also, the same root as integer of being whole, being the same person, being the person who cares about the thing everywhere you are. And so, even though I'm much louder than she is, and I have a lot more sort of fire, she is the person who's made me who I am today. And her practice, her active practice of love, is something that I carry with me. So I'd very much like to invite her. She's someone who passed away when I was 18, and that was very hard, but I think actually really formative in my understanding and experience with life and death and cycles. And so definitely I'm gonna bring my experience of death and life with her into this conversation. So I just wanted to formally bring her in, invite her into this space, and carry her with me as we have this awesome conversation.
That's so beautiful. And welcome, Yejin's mom, to this space. And I definitely feel her presence in your words and all the things that you do. So I'm so honored that you named her and that she's here with us. So talking about being principled and really living with integrity, I feel like that is you. Like even when I first met you, I think it's probably been about a decade now since our lives first crossed, and we actually used to be in the same office space. And so I'm really curious. Could you take us on a journey? Because you have worn many hats in nonprofits, everything from organizing to fundraising to the work that you do now. Take us on a little journey. How have all of these experiences helped you shift to what you're doing now?
Yeah, I thanks for that question. I like to think about the journey of how we arrived where we are. I think a lot about arrival. And I grew up in a very, very white environment. And I grew up first in an area that was a little bit more, immigrant oriented and diverse. And then in order to get me to like a better public school district, my family ended up moving me not too far, but to a community that's, I think, like 98% white. That's like hella white. Right. And so I remember just kind of like losing myself. And even though I was a really principled person as a young one, I remember there was a bully in preschool who would push me and my Indonesian friend. And there was one time where I just like started biting her ankle after she shoved me. So that's who I was. But then by the time I was in high school and surrounded by all these white folks, I was just turning into like a really obsequious person. Like I just wanted to be liked. I wanted to be accepted. And by the time that I got to college, I sort of returned to myself in a way. I found a community of practice of folks, mostly folks of color, who were really passionate about understanding how we arrived at racism, experiences of racism. And so from there, I was like, okay, I want to do good things. And so I entered the nonprofit world, started off meeting you through I think it was an AmeriCorps program, and that just like wasn't enough for me to sustain a financially independent life. And so I ended up leaving that experience early, but I was so grateful to meet you and to have this lifelong friendship and camaraderie with you. Ended up falling into organizing. I studied a lot of like movement theory, post-colonial theory, feminist theory when I was in college, and was really eager to translate that. So I started off being really cerebral and heady. And in fact, I actually liken that to my relationship to grief. Like, I think the way that I first processed grief, my mom died when I was a freshman in college, was to intellectualize. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to stay in my head, because like feeling the feelings is just way too scary and way too much. And so that was also a time when I invested all of my learning in my brain. And so it was really heady. And I remember the first time that I had to write like a legislative memo for a job, and they were like, what the hell are you saying? So I was like writing like post-colonial theorists, and they were like, I don't think this is going to translate. And so shortly after college, I started being really obsessed with practice. Like, how do you apply things? All of these things that I learned are really important. And that was also sort of translating to like, oh, maybe I also need to apply these things to my own experience of grief. So this whole time, this journey for me has been deeply personal. So I was organizing for a bit, and then thought that maybe I wanted to be a lawyer. And so had 4 very long months as a paralegal where I was like, I do not, in fact, want to be a lawyer. So it was just like really important for me to come to that realization. So I went back to the nonprofit world and fell into fundraising. And if anyone out there is a fundraiser, like, kudos to you. It is really hard work. It is also kind of the worst, especially if you're someone who's really principled, because I think that, you know, the closer you get to money, the more you see concessions that organizations will make in service of having more funding. And obviously, in some ways, that's very understandable. But as someone who learned, you know, from college to my early career to start translating what it means to actually care about racial equity, started seeing the possibilities or impossibilities that organizations could translate their espoused values into action. So I liked fundraising just because it gave me access to lots of information. I'm like a little bit of a busybody, so I got to know the programming like the back of my hand, but then also had some exposure to boards and board decision-making processes and governing models, and, you know, relating those things again to, you know, why this programming is actually turning out to be really pathologizing to the people that we're serving. Like, what is the relationship between what's going on up here to like what's actually translating to programs? And then also, really importantly, what staff are experiencing. I think a lot of times when people talk about equity work, they really do focus on, in some ways understandably, the people served, particularly if they're like minoritized or marginalized communities, but like also the staff, especially staff who are the folks who are in the work because they actually have the experiences of the folks that we serve. So, you know, started getting really attuned to that. I met my expiration date for fundraising earlier than I thought I would. I think as someone who is very principled, it was just like really hard to constantly make these concessions. Like, you know, continuing to have relationships with donors who say terrible things about the people we serve, or treat fundraisers like the help, especially if you have fundraisers of color. Treating a wealthy white woman who's in fundraising like the help is very different from treating a woman of color like the help. So I just like wasn't really able to handle it. And then sort of moved, because I started doing operation stuff. I was like, I don't want to do frontline fundraising. I don't want to have to be in conversation with these racist donors. And I don't want to be on a leash. I don't want to be controlled around how I respond to folks. So like, let me just focus on like the back end process stuff. And because I think I was someone who started becoming really good at identifying root causes and then figuring out like where in processes, you know, being in operations made sense. So I just sort of transitioned into fundraising operations. And, you know, again, I met my expiration date. So I was actually able to go into a position around organizational design, which is about operationalizing ideas. But what I insisted on was that I would be equity informed. So even something as boring as like, okay, we need to develop out a CRM or a client relationship management system, thinking about like, who are the folks who use it the most often? Is it frontline staff, or frontline staff most likely to be, you know, darker skinned people of color? And then why are they not a part of the process of creating this thing? So even something as granular, and I sometimes think that, you know, where things are really boring, inequity can just live forever because people don't want to talk about it or think about it. So I was doing that, and then I got laid off, and that was the first time. And this was, you know, half a year into the pandemic, and that was really hard and painful, and I'd never been laid off before. And by this point, I'd already been doing some career coaching, particularly for folks of color, so I could like coach myself in an intellectual way, but still I was like heartbroken and feeling, worthless, and that all the work that I had done was not enough to matter. But I think I took that opportunity to then be like, maybe this is this is a moment to try something new. And so I decided, because this was also, months after the murder of George Floyd and these uprisings and rebellions, all these institutions were suddenly like more willing to spend money on work that they said that they've been doing for a really long time. So I was like, okay, maybe I can try this out and just see how it goes. And it's been going well. I've been experiencing abundance, and have a lot of things that I think are about me, and I think there are a lot of contextual things that have nothing to do with me, but that's sort of the journey. And I will say that all of the experiences that I've had in my life and also in my career are 1000% informing the work that I'm doing. So for example, I did a workshop recently on, confronting racism at work, specifically for people of color, 3 hours, talking about how it's really frustrating. Like, we have to acknowledge the fact that, the burden of strategy falls on people of color after they experience racism. We have to do that work because the white folks or people who are upholding white supremacy are not doing their work. So acknowledging that, and then thinking like, how do we more safely self-advocate, knowing that, thrashy people might punish us for doing it. And so I just, I say that everything that I share is not necessarily like, I'm an expert on this thing, but it's like, I'm an expert on my experiences, and I've gathered so much experience and insight being a principled person in institutions, hopping from job to job every 1 to 2 years because I could not fuck with people anymore. So I collected all these experiences and, share them with folks. And that's just sort of how I position my expertise. It's more that I just have these experiences that I want to share.
Yeah, and you said so much wisdom in this journey. I'm going to pick one area, then I'm going to just go back because there's a lot. I was getting like aha moments constantly. So one of the things you said was grief work. And I'm so thankful that you named that, because a lot of people don't deal with grief. They don't want to talk about that. And I think if nothing else, this pandemic has actually forced many people to deal with grief. Not just necessarily the loss, right? We're seeing the loss of human lives. But I would actually say there's a lot of grief in other ways that people are dealing with. So bringing it back to you, there was a closure, a death of something when you got laid off. So what did you have to say goodbye to?
Yeah, I really appreciate your centering this conversation around grief. I do want to share that for a very long time, I ran away from it by intellectualizing, by making myself really, really, really busy so I wouldn't have time to process things, which didn't ultimately work because, things would show up in my dreams, or repression doesn't always work, right? But it took me a long time to understand what grief could be like and feel like and what it can be applied to. So because my first real big experience was with my mother's death, I just sort of, associated it with like, loss of human life. But I realized that, there are so many things to grieve. There's so many types of loss. And, I think that after I was laid off, I had to grieve the loss of this idea that I was irreplaceable. Like, I think that it was humbling in a sense, not in the perspective of like, oh, I should be humbled or anyone should be humbled if they're laid off. It's more like, I think that my attachment to utility and institutions in like a particular formation was something that I had to let go of. I also was really attached to this idea that I would always work in institutions, that I never wanted to lead my own thing. I truly, people would say things like, oh, Yejin, you could start your own practice. And I'd be like, never, never. And so, yeah, I think it was this moment of like, oh, my relationship to institutions, my devotion to institutions was something that I had to let go of in this experience in order to process the negative feelings, the self-deprecating feelings that came with being laid off. And so, yeah, that's something that I actually got like continue to have to process. It might sound silly to some that, it happened a long time ago and I'm now doing really well as a solo practitioner. But, it's still something I process. But I would say that my attachment to the way I relate to work is the thing that I really had to let go of.
That is so powerful, right? Our attachments to the way we relate to work. And some of it has to do to a certain degree about how we define our own worth and our own value. Who are we without our connection to these organizations or institutions or the work, that work? Right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, particularly for folks who are really mission driven or care about certain values, there are only a few like valid expressions of passion and purpose. And I think one of them is that you devote your life to an institution or to a cause. And the way that it expresses itself is that you are willing to experience self-sacrifice in service of this institution, in service of this movement. And yeah, that's something that I work with a lot of clients on, especially if they're folks of color, especially women and femmes of color. Yeah, what does passion and purpose look like outside of a capitalistic context? And it's really wild to try to have that conversation because it's
right. And then also to be in the space now because you run your own business, you run your own practice, and that brings a whole other set. Right? I'm speaking from experience of someone that feels this with you, right? That brings a whole other set of things that come up that you didn't even know you had
Absolutely.
to deprogram from yourself, right?
Yeah.
I don't even know where to go next. Let me think for a second. Everywhere, right? Because it is really deep, right? And if we tie so much of our identity, especially because, I feel this. I went into nonprofit movement work because it was a very personal thing, right? Usually most people don't, like they don't necessarily think like, I'm going to go take a job where I'm going to be severely underpaid, undervalued, willingly, unless they have some connection to wanting to make their communities better, the world better, right? And I'm going to name those things because as much as, nonprofit sector wants to do good work, there's also another side of it, right? And so one thing to me that has become abundantly clear, and you started to talk about this, so I want to go down that path. You're leading me to that path. So one thing that's become really abundantly clear to me in the last decade, I would say, maybe even more, is the way that nonprofits, even with their best of intentions, are still set up and still operate from a very dominant white supremacist capitalist framework. And, it's from like the way that money is distributed, the way that we have leadership models, staff structures. I can go on and on. And so, even those of us, who identify and who are from communities of color and other, different expressions, right, of communities that the nonprofit sector would deem vulnerable, right? Even those of us who are from those communities, in some ways, unknowingly, and maybe knowingly, I would even argue, maybe even knowingly, perpetuate the very things that we're fighting against. And I know you have many examples because, like you said, because you're so principled, like you were not going to be you weren't going to put yourself in those situations. So I did want to shed light of the work that you're doing now, right? To kind of, I don't want to say bridge the gap, but really to tackle this issue head on, this contradiction that I'm seeing in nonprofit social justice and movement work. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the work that you do, and the way that you phrase it on your website is untethering nonprofits from white supremacy culture. So what types of offerings do you have that will help folks who are working in this industry to really pull ourselves away and think about new ways that we can do this work?
Yeah, it is so tricky. I have a lot of gratitude for the experiences that I've had that all led me to arrive in this moment and, become the person that I am today. And also, we could acknowledge the wild limitations of the setup of the 501c3, right? I think if you think of just if we start really high level, this idea that, ultimately foundations, which are, arms of corporations or, family foundations that come from, familial wealth, that they are ultimately the ones responsible for providing things that all humans should have all the time, like access to education, access to healthcare. The fact that they are the ones who are funding all of this is just like, that shouldn't be how it is, right? Like it shouldn't be dependent on the mood of funders, people who have money. And I think similarly, the way that, boards are set up, or this idea that someone who has access to power and or wealth, ultimately being the one responsible for not maybe granular service provision, but are ultimately the ones responsible for the institution. It's also like you can have money and zero expertise, right? So I think that there's just, if you think about top down ways in which expressions of power can be really harming and damaging, not only to staff, but also to the people who are ultimately served, like that gives you sort of a big picture sense of what could be problematic. But, the reason that I continue to do work with nonprofits in large part is, the people that I care about, the folks who are literally in my world or just like in my extended world, given our shared values, are often people who are going to do work because that is where people can get paid to do this kind of work, right? And so for me, I've realized, shortly after the race rebellions following the murder of George Floyd, that what I wanted to do was actually do not only protective work for communities that I care about, which includes a lot of people of color who work in nonprofits, but also transformational work. And so that's sort of how I decided that I wanted to really focus my efforts on nonprofits. I do believe I describe myself as an angry optimist. I'm an optimist because I believe people and institutions can transform and be better. And I'm angry all the time because people aren't doing the work they should be doing. But ultimately, I do believe in the possibility of transformation. I think that there are larger questions around the utility of reforming an institution that is inherently sort of set up to reproduce white supremacy, capitalism. But for me right now, it's what's good enough is to know that I'm offering some support and protection to communities that I care about, whether it's staff or the people who are ultimately served by nonprofits. And so the work that I do right now, I spend a lot of time coaching. So if I'm doing it from the institutional perspective, I'm coaching people who are in leadership positions. And really am quite selective. I say that I'm not for everyone and not everyone is for me, because I spent so much of my life in nonprofits accommodating whiteness, accommodating fragility, accommodating, for the sake of strategy, but I don't want to lose myself anymore. And so in this new iteration of my life, I'm like, you know what, if we're not aligned enough, if you're too emotionally thrashy, if you can't stop being defensive, then like, I can't do it. There might be someone else who's really wonderfully set up to do that for you. I am not that person. So, I'll work with aligned leaders who really want to understand the gap that exists between what they say they value and how they're showing up. And so a lot of times I actually interview their staff, because what is leadership coaching in a vacuum? Like, people have perspectives about themselves, and they are often not grounded in what people are experiencing. So I do that. I do some org consulting. I sort of specialize in race equity audits. So really trying to do and uncover root cause analysis of what are the expressions and experiences of inequity and injustice that people of color experience in the organization, and what are their roots? Is it like the actual governing model? Is it, coming from, your strategy or lack of process around internal communications, which maybe is actually about who you value, who you think deserves knowledge in the institution. So do some of that work. And then I do some capacity building workshops. So I've been doing a lot of, workshops for white folks who want to move beyond performative allyship. And then the individual work that I do individual coaching. I've actually started moving away from career coaching. I just say that it's coaching, and if it's about the job, then it could be related to career. But sometimes I actually focus, especially with women and femmes of color, around emotional divestment from work. Especially after they've experienced patterns of racism and are set up to just keep experiencing harm. Yeah, so a lot of that work is around, how do we access a more liberatory space? Sometimes it means divesting from work and finding passion and purpose somewhere else. And sometimes it's really literally about like, how do I survive my experience? Because I literally need this job. And then one thing that I just wanted to say, like I am a very principled person. I also, though, have access to certain kinds of resources and privilege that made it easier for me, that, informed a reality that made it easier for me to make choices to leave. And that's not accessible to everyone. So I did want to name that.
Yeah, no, and thank you for naming that, because it's also just recognizing, even though we are part of systems and we're experiencing a certain degree, right, of harm in these systems, to also acknowledge where we do have privilege. And I think that's this work too, is to acknowledge where we have access when other communities don't. You got my ears like perked up when you talked about divestment. And it reminded me of our previous conversation around attachment. So I'm curious, when you're working, especially with, like you said, women and femmes of color, to not have such an attachment to work and to find joy and to find meaning and to find purpose in other places. Yeah, I don't even know if I have like a specific question, but I was just curious, how did that come up? Is it like a running theme that you were seeing, or is it from your own personal experience?
Yeah, I would say that it's from all of the above. I think that I just noticed in my own experiences, and also being in therapy and often talking about work, being really resistant to this idea that I was somehow participating in negative experiences that I would have. And obviously there are a lot of external factors, right? So there are the external factors of like managers being shitty or people gaslighting, or and so I want to acknowledge that. And it took me a long time to take responsibility for the choices that I was making and understanding ways in which I am an agent in my decisions. And so I just learned over time that my level of emotional investment in institutional change, combined with my, I talk a lot about rooting things in our subjectivity. So for me, I'm an angry and impatient person. And it often I was setting myself up to experience a lot of punishment without being strategic. And so I had to learn okay, actually, one of the things that my therapist taught me, he was saying that my level of emotional investment in my colleagues and the people who became my friends and comrades was part of what led me to being very unstrategic about the conflict that I would dive into. So I would have zero plans because I was an impatient person, and I would be like, that's messed up. I'm just going to dive in. I'm going to start yelling at the executive director, maybe not yelling, but have a confrontation and then experience punishment. And not really have thought strategically about anything. And so when I started a next job, my therapist was like, I would like for you to experiment with something if you're down with it. I would like for you to, rather than do the thing you normally do, I like to work relationally. I love developing relationships. And so sometimes when I would start a new job, I would be like, Noilyn, let's talk. I'm holding your head in my hands. Let's know each other. And as a result, I would care deeply. And if you experience something messed up, I would immediately go into fight mode. And so my therapist was like, I would like you to try when you start something new to not do that. Allow yourself to develop relationships, but don't do the usual thing. And so that was my first example and practice of, it's proactive, preemptive divestment. It's stop yourself from the thing. And so that was my first experience with that. But, one of the things that as I started doing this full time, and primarily working with people of color, just the amount of healing that people of color have to do from their current or previous experiences and the lack of space for that. And so also my partner, my husband, is a musician. And so a lot of my people are like artists, and their relationship to their economic work, I mean, it's in part because like this society does not value what they should value, does not value the arts. And as a result, people often separate economic work from the passion and purpose that they find in other expressions of their art. And so I was drawing from that, and I was like, you know what? If people's short-term goals around their careers is actually just to have the emotional spaciousness to heal, so that they are not constantly activated, they are constantly not reminded of, you know, painful experiences they have, then that actually might mean that they need to divest from their career, at least in the short term. And so that's sort of how it came about. There were just all these patterns of like, oh, this is happening over and over again because you've had zero space to heal. And I think for people who, again, are really mission driven or like really want to live their values, you know, they keep ending up in spaces that are probably nonprofit or movement based, but they keep experiencing the harm and they keep reliving things from the past. And so for me, it's really just a strategic thing. It's like, okay, if you want to be able to heal and have the space for that, it means like you can't keep showing up in the work in the same way, and not to make them responsible for it, but to be like, you can make choices to deprioritize your work in favor of your healing. And some people do that within their jobs, and some people choose to leave and then do something that has nothing to do with nonprofits, right? So sometimes I'm like, maybe you should get a job that you don't give a shit about for a while. And so you can focus your time on X, Y, and Z. And so, yeah, that's how I
yeah,
arrived.
absolutely. And I feel that on a lot of levels. It's such sage advice because, I mean, what I'm getting from this is to give yourself the space, both literally like physical space, and also the space to just get really in tune with what it is that you need. And we go back to this idea of like showing up whole, right? And part of that healing is to like reconcile these fragmented parts of ourselves that we're either, you know, told in different ways, whether it's obvious or not, like in the workspaces, like you got to shut this down so that you can be palatable, you could be acceptable, right? And it's hard to like kind of operate from that. Or like, as you said, you know, maybe we need to just reframe this a little bit. Like, the truth is we live in a capitalistic society, right? We need to pay our bills. And what would it mean if you could detach from that a little bit so that you can also be whole and you can heal? So I think that's like a, you know, just like I said, I think it's really sage advice of that we're not just our jobs, that there's other avenues, right? For our passion, we can still do this work, and it can look like many different things. I think you're an example of that. You can still be doing incredible, meaningful, impactful work for your community. It doesn't necessarily have to be at a nonprofit, for example, right? Just to be open, right? There's a full spectrum of the ways that we could do this work. Yeah, and then the other
Yeah.
thing that came up too as you were talking, I was like, you know what? What I'm hearing is that you're not giving the power or control to this institution for your happiness, for your wholeness, for your wellness. That you are taking an active step to decide that you are in control. And to me, that's really liberation, and that's sovereignty and agency in a different level. I'm deciding how I'm showing up to this. I'm deciding that I'm going to divest right now so that I can take care of myself. And no one can take that away because you get to decide.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like I should write a letter to my therapist and be like, all the things that I've learned are showing up in my coaching. But one of the things that, you know, he taught me was even around like me being principled, it would often combined with my impatience and anger would lead me to being unstrategic, would lead me down certain paths. And so he would talk about, and he's like, you know, your level of integrity is a gift, and also like you should be an active agent of control over it, right? So like you should treat it like a valve and be an active agent in controlling like when you use it, when you don't use it, when you use it less, in service of strategy, in service of your preservation, in service of your long-term goals. And so I really translate that in my coaching. And so sometimes we talk about our defaults. Like I think, my approach to the work is a combination of like awareness and attunement building and translating that awareness and knowledge, new knowledge into praxis, because I feel like one without the other is just kind of foolishness. So it needs to be combined. But sometimes I'll be like, we'll talk about strengths, right? And then think about how our strengths can actually work in service of something negative, or how it might work against our goal of emotional divestment. So someone who really loves achieving in service of, the mission might actually have a really hard time divesting. So their strength, I think that makes them amazing at what they do, might actually be a barrier to their short-term goals. So thinking about like level of agency and control and being like, one, do I recognize that my default is showing up? How do I actually interrupt it and disrupt it? And then how do I actually take a step back? And that's not to say like maybe that's actually the right way of being to meet your goal, but might not be. But being the person who takes a step back to actively choose, that is a level of agency that I really want to support in folks who want to be more liberated from their experiences. So it is interesting, this like relationship between control and liberation.
Yeah.
Right? Those are like words that maybe shouldn't go together. But in this instance, I think that, just level of agency and autonomy and being the one who actively decides all the time, which isn't always possible, right? Like emotional reactivity happens. And especially if you're someone who's experienced racial trauma, like it can be really hard to do that. But where we can, we want to build that muscle and exercise it so that everyone has a lot of agency in how they show up.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to talk about DEI work. So diversity, equity, inclusion, for those that don't know. And I don't know about you, but it's like I'm hearing it everywhere, even in spaces where you wouldn't think that you would hear it, right? Like corporate America. And I have a colleague who recently got a job. She's going to be a DEI director on Broadway. The Great White Way, right? So interestingly enough. So Yejin, you're like seeped in this work right now, like deep. This is your work. What is DEI to you?
Well, first of all, I'll say there are so many ways to do work, right? And so I don't want to universalize my way. And I'll say that I actually no longer use those terms to describe my work, in part because of what you're talking about. I think that to me, a lot of the companies and organizations that are really publicly talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, to me, it's like a very corporate sanitized version. And so for me, what I'm interested in talking about is identifying, confronting, disrupting, and appending power. And if one's DEI initiatives does that, then like, that's cool. I don't care what you call it. But a lot of DEI work is not about that. A lot of DEI work, in my opinion, is window dressing. A lot of it is not about root cause analysis. There's no interest in changing the way power functions. And if that's the case, I'm also once again selective with institutions. So if I get the sense that an institution really is not interested in understanding how power, whether it's racial power, patriarchal power, white supremacist power, like all of these, if they're not interested in like truly understanding that and possibly finding a new way of orienting or sharing it, then I'm like, that's not the real work. That's not transformational work, which isn't to say I do think that, a lot of behavioral changes is really important. I think a lot of DEI programs do that. And I think that behavioral changes are good for short-term reduction of harm that people experience. So I use the example of like, okay, maybe someone knows that, calling me as an East Asian person exotic is problematic. So they're not going to use exotic anymore. But then if they don't understand the histories of racism, if they don't understand the roots of, xenophobia in relation to US imperialism, like they're not going to fully understand. And so it's going to keep manifesting in other ways. So I feel like behavioral change important as a short-term way of reducing harm. But if you don't then require the organization to understand how power is functioning in ways that are oppressive and causing harm, and if you're not willing to change the way that that functions, then I actually don't believe that that's an organization that is interested in transformation. And so, yeah, I think that there are some people who call themselves DEI practitioners who are doing work in confronting power, and that's amazing. And I think there's a greater number of people who focus on the really shallow. And again, that's not to say that I don't mean shallow as like a disparaging word. I just mean it descriptively. It's like not going deep. I think that that work is important, and it is not the end of it, but it is treated that way. So that's the long and short of it. Like, I think that, the other thing that I'll say is, maybe a couple of months after the uprisings began, after George Floyd's murder, I saw people posting. They were like, oh, suddenly we have money for, we said we never had money, but suddenly we have money for a DEI director or a DEI consultant. But I would see from the job description that this is a boilerplate thing, and that this organization actually jumped the gun and fundamentally doesn't understand what this work is, and it's showing in the job description. Or they'll create an RFP, or request for proposal, for a DEI consultant, and the scope of work will be so huge, and the pay will be so small, and there's no involvement of staff. And so I'm like, once again, this is signaling to me that you're not ready to do this. And I know there can be a really hard tension, right? Like, there's a sense of urgency. Oh, we're like 400 years late in doing this work. Let us like rush it now. And so like, yeah, I want to honor that there's a sense of urgency, but if you're doing it completely wrong, then like, maybe it's better to wait. So I do think that there's this rush that organizations have been feeling, and it's translating to shallow, meaningless work, which might be a little harsh, but I think that that is one of the things that's happening. And then the last thing that I'll say is, there are way too many white people getting paid a lot to do DEI work, when there are in particular Black folks who have been doing this work for a really, really long time, who are dope and amazing, who are not getting paid. I think that consulting culture, especially in nonprofits, it's heavily white. And so, I'm part of a BIPOC consultancy, social justice consultancy, because, legitimizing people of color who have not only experiential expertise, but also like many other kinds of expertise, have a much harder time securing work. And so, that's also something to note.
Yeah, and thank you so much for actually raising that. I am curious though, because oftentimes when people, hear about this work, right? DEI work, anti-racism work, people who look like us, for better or for worse, may not be seen as folks that can facilitate this work. So where do you think Asian Americans fit into this space?
Ooh, what a big ass question. I think that in general, as you well know, we are often excluded. There's like many ways in which we have been rendered invisible as people of color in this country. People like refer to things like the Chinese Exclusion Act on occasion, but don't really integrate the kind of other racial othering that we've experienced historically in the way that we talk about race. So I think that like there's a huge issue, and have really interesting conversations with particularly AAPI folks who do racial justice work around like where we fit here. That's maybe just like a 4-hour conversation for another time. But, I think when it comes to this work, one of the things that I really like to do, in addition to like really rooting things in my subjectivities, is also like really focusing on the ways in which I hold power and privilege. And there is something difficult in doing that as an East Asian petite woman doing this work in some ways. And so, I want to hold the tension between like, ooh, we live in a context where the experiences of AAPI folks is not given space, in part because of like the deep anti-Blackness of this country. And so I think that, that's one piece. And so how do I not only process this for the sake of the work, but also like process this for myself and process my own experiences of racism, and, do that racial healing work. So that's one piece. And then there's the other piece of like, okay, in particular, I'm also not only East Asian, Korean, I'm also someone who grew up with class privilege. I'm also someone who grew up with educational privilege. So like, how do I balance these things? But as far as the work, you know, I think part of what's made me like successful in not necessarily like I'm successful, but successful in working with many other facilitators of different races is because I do the self-location work. So I can identify, and I think that my desire to hold complexity and to hold multitudes and to be whole, you know, what we've been talking about is in some ways what makes other facilitators of color more comfortable with the way that I show up in this work. And I think that also rooting things in just who I am, I think my relationship to anger is something that is perhaps like comforting to other folks of color. But yeah, I've actually had experiences in workshops where people are like, I don't think you should be the person talking about this. And I'm like, I totally get that. And I hold that. And, you know, once again, you know, you can hold the tension of like accountability and also honoring, this is who I am. These are my experiences. I'm not saying that I'm for everyone. So I think that there's something that has been useful and powerful about rooting things in specificity. You might remember that I put together, or I helped coordinate like a racial healing retreat for Asians for racial justice. And I was really specific because I was like, you know what, in order for us to be messy together in a way that's really generative, I actually think we need to share a lot of experiences and perspectives. So what I had in the description, I was like, are you an AAPI person who has been thinking or feeling about racial justice work for a while? And has your expression of your investment in racial justice translated to you actually repressing your experiences of racism in service of, you know, uplifting Black organizers or those experiences? And then has that accidentally led to you having a transactional approach to solidarity by accident, which is accidentally upholding white supremacy? If that's you, come talk to us. And so I was like, this is so specific. I don't know if people are going to show up, but we had like 24 people register. And so there's just something I think about the specificity and me saying, I'm not for everyone, not everyone is for me. And that just makes more room for freedom to be my whole self. And I think it just also makes it clearer to people whether they want to come to my workshops or be in community with me. And I don't take offense. You know, there are some folks who are like, I don't think you should be doing this kind of work. And I will take that feedback and think about it and incorporate it. And there are some people who are like, wow, you're really just so confrontational and you really would reach so many more people if you weren't so angry. And I'm like, that's cool. There are people who do this work who aren't so angry, and like, you can access them.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm thinking of this as you're saying it too, like even beyond, you know, GI work, but it's like you're so rooted in that specificity. You know what it is that you offer and who this might benefit, right? And there is nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being super, super clear. Yeah. And also to be like just at that point where you know what your gifts are and you're willing to share it, and then not to be, I guess, deterred or distracted or discouraged from sharing that. As you said, like, you know, there's so many things that are out there. There's so many offerings. There's so many other consultants. There's something for everyone. And I just think as an entrepreneur, for example, if we could just kind of go there, right, is to not feel like you got to be everything to everyone.
Yeah.
You still can offer your gifts out to the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, honestly, I feel like if we try to be everything to everyone, how much of ourselves do we lose? And, you know, I think about going back to grief and loss. I recently was talking to a coaching client about like every time we make a concession to a white manager or at work in order for our own self-preservation or survival, that's a loss. It's something that we have to hold and process. And so having, even though I was a very angry person in institutions, I also like was really strategic often and like had to do a lot of hand holding to get people to a place where they could hear feedback, and I would have to fucking practice over and over again to get to that place. Like I made so many concessions and lost pieces of myself. And so I think that, it's a way of honoring my experiences, rooting things in my specificities, and like being okay with the fact that not everyone is going to identify with that. And in fact, I think rooting ourselves in our experiences and our specificities, to me, is a way of moving away from the scarcity mindset, right? Like I don't have to be everything to everyone, because there are Noylyns and there are other folks who approach things in different ways and have different experiences that are going to call people in a different way that, so I think that there's just something really powerful about that. And I know that there are things about my experiences that make it easier for me to be like picky in this way, but I do think that there's something cool about like, you know what, I have these initial consults with folks and we'll talk about alignment, and sometimes I'll be like, you know what, I don't know that this feels super aligned. Or they might say, you know what, the way your anger shows up like is a little bit triggering for me. And I'm like, I totally understand that. I really appreciate your sharing that with me. And here are other folks you can work with. So there's no like hard feelings about it. I think that if we can be really honest about our limitations, it's actually a really freeing thing. Yeah. And then, I did want to say one more thing about being a person who looks like this doing the work. I also think in general, we are as a society very bad at accountability. Like whether we're called in or called out, people talk about cancel culture. I think, our desire to avoid conflict is actually a product of white supremacy, because it enables us to keep maintaining power as it is. And I've worked really hard on being someone who does not crumble, someone who does not fall into a shame spiral. And so I invite people to call me in, whether it's with organizational clients or call out. I don't want to police how people's tone. And I've gotten really comfortable with it. And I actually think that's a really important piece of this. So I think that I build trust in the community of practitioners by being like, I'm really open to it. And so people will say like, Yejin, that was problematic. And then I'll post on Instagram that this was problematic and this is what I'm doing. I'm actually going to sit with it. Here's the cause. I think that I was moving too fast. And when I do that, I stop actually internalizing new information. So I just think that, vulnerability and being able to sit with yourself and just actually shift rather than make your default defense, make your default an openness and invitation. What would it mean if we were to believe people? And what becomes possible when we do that? So I think that that's just another piece around being a person who looks like this in the work. Developing trust, I think, requires accountability and vulnerability.
Yeah, accountability, vulnerability. And then you talked about scarcity, right? I think that's actually a very white supremacist concept, right? At the end of the day, it's to believe that there's not enough for everyone, that only certain groups can have it, as opposed to this idea around collective care, around, understanding that there's always something else that's out there. And, I think about many of our cultures, we don't necessarily have, we've like learned this concept, especially those of us who have, that are living here, right, in the US. But if you actually kind of like peel back and look at how many of our cultures are, they don't actually operate like that. So for me, when I think about like unlearning white supremacy as somebody who is from a lineage of people that were colonized, to me, it's also decolonizing work. It's like remembering who we are and to think about how am I operating, even like in the smallest ways, right, of the way that we move around this world. I was like, actually, no, this is not how it was before in so many parts of our lives. And so, thank you for lifting that up and seeing how, it's like a constant, even though you're doing this work, even though I'm doing this work, we're continuing to learn and unlearn and relearn, right? So that we could
100%.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to round out this conversation. You took a pretty big leap, to leave from something that was super secure. And then I know it was because of like an outside circumstance that just kind of pushed you. But you could have decided that you were going to just get another job, whether it's nonprofit or somewhere else, another institution. But you decided to actually make it out and go on your own. So, what advice would you have for folks who might be in a similar place and maybe a little bit scared? What would you tell them?
Mm. Well, I would like to talk to everyone individually because I just feel like I have a hard time thinking about like blanket advice, in part because of like I don't want to suggest that everyone can access this, or but I guess what I will say is that I really took the time because of my communities of care, to sit with what I was feeling as a result of the layoff. And I think taking time to sit with my pain, to sit with my grief, to sit with my anger, all of those things really helped ground me before making a decision. I did make the decision that I would take a little bit of time to decide what I wanted to do next. But I am typically someone who makes decisions really quickly, and I just sort of like go without. I also am very lucky that I'm not someone who like sits with regret very often. But sometimes the way that that works against me is that I don't take the time and space to really reflect and ground my decision from like my gut and my heart. Um, so yeah, I think that, if there's a possibility of just sitting with all the things that led you to where you are, all of the feelings, all even the negative ones, the ones that are painful, and using that. I like to say that feelings are data. If you like understand yourself and you understand your circumstances, that feelings are just information. It can give you a sense of what are the kinds of things that really activate you positively, what are the things that trigger you, and that is really good information. And so I guess I suggest that people take time to really be attuned to like what it is that they're looking for. But as far as people who are sure that they want to take the leap, and start something new, I think community, 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 community. Like honestly, the people. I've always, even though I'm a very social person, I've always hated networking because it feels like transactional and icky. And I was joking that like my anti-network networking was I'm never like meeting with executive directors and people in decision making. I'm like forming community with people who are doing the work. And not that I want this to be a strategy, but I just wanted to share that the reason that I was getting work, even though I just had transitioned into being a solo practitioner, is because I had built trust with my community of practice. And they were the ones who advocated for me to be hired either as an executive coach. Actually, my first executive coaching gig came because a friend of mine was like, I'm working with this organization, you do coaching, but are you ready for executive coaching? And I was like, no. And then she reminded me, she was like, every time you have handheld any executive director to do the right thing, that was executive coaching. And so I was pushed by my community of practice. So I would say that, really spending time, again, not in a transactional way, not with the intent of getting work, but really investing emotionally and spiritually and psychically in community of practice, I think leads to abundance. It's like you're more likely to experience abundance. So that's the one piece of advice I guess I would give, like really ground yourself in community, because those are the people who are going to show up for you and then speak your name in a room.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, ground yourself in community. It's community care. You've been hearing lately, right? Healing doesn't happen in isolation, it happens in community. And so let's lean into our communities. And I love how you also brought up this concept of time. It's okay to take time, and there's power in a pause so that you can feel all the feelings. Like you said, let's not get caught up in our feelings, but feelings are just data. They're here to tell us something, maybe things that we've been ignoring for a super, super long time.
That's
Yeah.
right.
And so we just kind of honor where we are. I love it. So, where can our listeners connect with you, Yejin?
Hmm. Our listeners can connect with me, I guess, on my website, yejinlee.co, yejinlee.co. If you want, you can follow me on Instagram. My handle is Yejin, Yejin_Lee, Lee. Just a note that this is not a professional account. This is like Yejin is a whole person account. So I have like very angry, anti-capitalist, anti-imperial, anti-racist stories. And then I have random dances, sometimes dog videos. So, it runs the gamut for sure, but folks can connect with me there. And I'm very interested in building community. Like I'm very responsive to folks because I want this to be a community of practice. So yeah, reach out.
I love it. Check her out. I enjoy it. She's one of my favorite folks on Instagram because of her dances, probably. So last question. So bringing it back to the title of this series, what does being a creator mean to you, Yejin?
I actually really struggled with this question. You gave me time, thank you, to think about it, because I never thought of myself as creative, never thought of myself as a creator, always sort of just identified as analytical. But I really enjoyed thinking about this, and I liked the more expansive approach that I had to take in order to consider myself a creator. So I would say that I think if you translate anything from your inner world into the external world, that means you're a creator.
I like that. I mean, I've heard a saying, right? An idea first comes internally, right, from your thoughts, and that it manifests in the physical space. So you to have this idea is the start of it. Yeah, I love it. So internal, external, beautiful.
Yeah.
So we're going to round out this conversation. I'm reading this book called Transitions by Julia Cameron. So instead of a card pull, we'll do a page pull. So just give me a number, and then we'll see what wisdom comes through.
37.
37. Interesting, because this was the same one that one of our other creators pulled, but it's okay to read it again. Birth brings me rebirth.
Ooh.
My heart expands to encompass new life and new responsibilities. The love of spirit loves through me, funding me with an abundant flow of gentle affection. I greet the souls that come into my care with tenderness and a sense of adventure. Ours is a shared journey. We are pilgrims traveling together to larger realms. The souls who are my intimates bear gifts for me by their presence, and I too bear gifts for those I love. Today my heart prepares a place for new arrivals. Grounded in spirit, I am strong, steady, and hospitable. A child at heart, I am the welcoming elder to the children that I meet.
Why you gotta make me cry at the end of this? It's so beautiful.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for picking that page, and also another reminder. Thank you. Thank you for your wisdom and all of your insight. And I hope that folks feel inspired by Yejin's story about being whole, living principle, and being in integrity with yourself. And also to be okay with being held accountable and how to be called in and called out for our larger growth and transformation and healing. So with that, I hope everybody enjoyed this conversation. We will continue these conversations in the weeks to come. So thank you once again, and everybody tune in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation and you'd like to help support this interview series, make sure to tune in to the next episode and share it with others. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at The Radiant You, you as in the letter U, and sign up for my newsletter by visiting www.theradiantu.com. Again, that's theradiantletteru.com. Thanks everyone, and remember, dream big, dream bold, and take brave steps. I'll see you next time.